I was married for 28 years. Last Tuesday, I found out my husband never existed. Not the way you might think. He existed. He was real enough. He sat across from me at the breakfast table every morning for nearly 3 decades. He fixed the leaking tap in our bathroom in Mississauga without being asked. He held my hand at my mother's funeral in Thunder Bay and cried, which I thought at the time was the most genuine thing I had ever witnessed in a human being. He was real. But the man I married, the man I believed I knew, was a character, a performance, and I was the only one in the audience who had not been told it was a show. My name is Margaret. I am 63 years old. I worked for 31 years as a registered nurse at Credit Valley Hospital, and I tell you that because I want you to understand something about me before I tell you the rest. I am not a naive woman. I have seen people in their most vulnerable, most honest moments. I have sat beside dying strangers and held their hands and watched the truth come out of people the way air leaves a body quietly, completely, without anything left behind. I thought that made me good at reading people. I thought I understood when someone was lying to me. I did not understand at all. My husband's name was Robert. We met at a community fundraiser in Oakville in the late 90s. He was volunteering at the registration table, and he handed me my name badge, and he said, with complete seriousness, that my handwriting on the sign-up form was the most elegant thing he had seen all evening. It was a ridiculous line. I laughed out loud. He laughed, too. We had coffee 3 days later, and we were inseparable after that. He was a financial planner. Careful with money, he always said, in the way that people who are careful with money always say it, as though it is a virtue they have cultivated rather than a trait they were born with. We were comfortable, not wealthy, but comfortable. We had a house in Mississauga near the lake. We had 2 children, our son Daniel, who is now 31 and lives in Vancouver, and our daughter Christine, who is 28 and teaches at an elementary school in Hamilton. We had a life that, from the outside, looked like exactly what it was supposed to be. Robert retired at 60. I kept working another 2 years because I was not ready to stop. When I finally did retire, we talked about traveling. Portugal was on the list, the east coast of Canada. We said we wanted to drive the Cabot Trail before we got too old to appreciate it. We talked about these things the way couples do, lazily, pleasantly, as though time was something we had in abundance. Then, 18 months ago, Robert told me he needed some space. I want you to sit with that for a moment. After 28 years, after 2 children, after a mortgage paid in full, and a retirement fund, and a leaking tap, and a mother's funeral in Thunder Bay. After all of it, he said he needed some space. He said it gently. He said he had been feeling disconnected for a while, and that he thought it might be good for both of us if he stayed with his brother in Calgary for a few weeks to clear his head. His brother's name was Frank. I had met Frank perhaps a dozen times over the years. He was quieter than Robert, a little awkward at family gatherings, divorced himself years ago. I had no reason to question it. People go through things. Marriages go through things. I told Robert I understood, and I meant it, because I did, because I was a woman who had spent 31 years learning to be steady in the middle of other people's chaos, and I was not going to fall apart over a few weeks apart. He left on a Thursday morning in October. He kissed me on the cheek at the door. He had one rolling suitcase and his brown winter coat. He said he would call when he landed. He called that evening, and the evening after. We spoke on the phone every 2 or 3 days. He said Calgary was cold, but Frank was good company. He sounded like himself, a little tired maybe, a little distant, but himself. 6 weeks became 3 months. I stopped counting after that. I told myself it was a rough patch. I told myself plenty of marriages had rough patches. I told Christine that her father and I were taking a little time apart, just to reset, and she listened with that careful, measured face she makes when she is worried, but does not want to say so. I told Daniel the same thing over video call, and he said, quietly, "Mum, are you okay?" I told him I was fine. I was not fine, but I was functional, which at 63 can feel like the same thing. In February, 4 months after Robert left, he called me on a Sunday afternoon and said he thought we should talk about separating properly. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking, and that he believed we had grown apart in ways that were not going to get better. He said he was sorry. He said he would always care about me. He used every phrase that people use when they have already made a decision and are simply informing you of it while using the language of discussion. I said very little. I think I said I understood. I think I said we should talk in person. He said yes, of course. He would come back to Mississauga in a few weeks to handle things properly. He never came back. I called Frank's number in late March, when I still had not heard from Robert about the visit he had promised. Frank answered on the third ring. There was a pause, just half a second too long, before he said hello. I asked to speak to Robert. Frank said Robert wasn't there. I asked where he was. Frank said he thought Robert was in touch with me directly. I said he had not been, not for 3 weeks. Another pause. Frank said he was sure Robert would call soon. His voice had the texture of a man reciting something he had prepared. I hung up and I sat in my kitchen for a very long time. I am not a woman who panics, but I am also not a woman who ignores what she already knows in her body before her mind has caught up. Something was wrong. Not the gentle, vague wrongness of a marriage drifting apart. Something specific and deliberate was wrong. I called Christine. She came over that evening. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything, the call with Frank, the weeks of silence, the pauses in conversation that had been getting longer. Christine listened, and then she said in a voice so carefully controlled, it frightened me. "Mum, there's something I need to tell you." She had known for 2 months. She had found out in January by accident when she was trying to mail her father a birthday card and asked Daniel for the Calgary address. Daniel had paused, just like Frank, that same half-second of someone recalibrating. And then, because Daniel is not built for sustained dishonesty, he told her everything. Robert was not in Calgary. He had not been in Calgary for more than 2 weeks before he quietly moved to a condominium in Victoria, British Columbia. Not Frank's, his own, in a building near the harbor, and he was not alone. Christine told me the name. I will not use it here. She was 44 years old. She had been in Robert's life, though I did not know that word yet, for 6 years. Not 6 weeks. Not 6 months. 6 years. She had a daughter of her own, a girl of 9, and Robert had been present for that child's life in ways I was only beginning to understand as Christine spoke. He had attended school events, Christmas mornings, a birthday party, at one of those inflatable play centers where children run themselves to exhaustion. He had been a father figure to a child I had never been told existed while he sat across from me at our breakfast table and talked about Portugal and the Cabot Trail. I dropped the mug I was holding. Tea went across the kitchen floor. Christine was out of her chair immediately, crouching down with paper towels, and I sat there and watched her clean it up because I had lost, temporarily, the ability to direct my own body. I said, "Daniel knew." She said, "Yes." I said, "For how long?" She said she thought he had known for longer than 2 months. She said she thought Daniel had found something on his father's phone at Christmas 2 years ago and had confronted Robert privately, and Robert had told him some version of the truth and made him promise silence with the argument that telling me would destroy the family. My son had sat across from me at Christmas dinner. He had called me on my birthday. He had said, "Mum, are you okay?" on that video call in February with the straightest face I have ever seen on a person I thought I knew. And he had known. I want to tell you that I cried. I want to tell you I had some clean, cinematic moment of grief that resolved itself into dignity. I did not. I sat in my kitchen in Mississauga for what felt like a very long time without making any sound at all. Christine kept talking, gently, and I heard her voice, but not the words for a while. Eventually I came back to myself. Eventually I made another cup of tea, because that is what we do, and I sat down and I asked Christine to tell me everything from the beginning. She did. Robert had met this woman at a professional conference in Vancouver 6 years ago. She was in the financial sector. They had begun as what Robert apparently called, in the conversation Christine had with him after she found out, a connection I didn't know how to end. He had told Christine that he had tried to end it twice and could not. He had told Christine that he had not meant for any of this to happen. He had told Christine these things as though they were a reasonable explanation, as though the arithmetic of his regret was supposed to balance the ledger. The condominium in Victoria was in his name. He had purchased it 14 months before he told me he needed space. 14 months, while we were talking about Portugal, while I was still working night shifts at Credit Valley and coming home to make dinner and fold laundry and exist in a life I believed was shared. He had already bought the apartment. He had already made the decision. He had simply not told me yet. There is a financial reality to these situations that people do not always discuss, and I think it is worth discussing clearly. Robert and I had joint savings, a pension, and investments that I had trusted him to manage for most of our marriage because he was the financial planner and I was the nurse, and we had divided our lives along those lines the way couples of our generation often did. I do not regret that trust, exactly, but I regret the shape that trust had taken the way. It had allowed me to not look closely, to not ask questions, to hand him a pen and sign documents he told me were routine. Some of those documents were not routine. It took my lawyer 3 months to work through what had happened to our finances. I hired her the week after Christine told me the truth, on the recommendation of a colleague from the hospital who had been through her own version of this kind of ending. My lawyer was thorough and patient, and she explained everything to me in language that did not make me feel foolish for not having known, which I needed more than I realized. Robert had not taken everything. He was not that kind of man, or perhaps he understood enough about the law to know it would not work. But he had structured things in ways that would have been very difficult to untangle without legal help. Certain accounts, certain assets. The condo in Victoria was in his name, not shared, so there was nothing to divide there. Our house in Mississauga was jointly owned, and that was the foundation of what I was entitled to. My lawyer knew what she was doing. We proceeded carefully. I called Daniel. I did not yell. I have thought about this many times, since why I did not yell, and I think it is because yelling at my son would have required me to be furious at him in that uncomplicated way. And my feelings for Daniel have never been uncomplicated. He was 31 years old and he had made a terrible choice, but he was also a person who had been handed an impossible secret by his father and told that keeping it was the price of keeping his family intact. Robert had put that weight on him. That was Robert's cruelty too. Not just the affair, not just the apartment, but the act of turning his son into a co-conspirator and calling it love. I told Daniel that I knew. I told him that I was not able to have a full conversation yet, and that I would call him again when I was ready. He said, "Mum, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I could hear that he was crying, and I said, "I know." And I meant that too. And then I ended the call because I could not hold his grief and my own at the same time. I was not ready. I focused on practical things. My lawyer, the house, my pension, which was mine alone, untouched, and which I was enormously relieved about. I called my financial advisor my own, separate from Robert, someone I had set up an independent meeting with in the first week, because I had decided that I was not going to be in a position of not knowing my own situation ever again. She was kind. She helped me understand where I stood. I stood, it turned out, in a position that was not as precarious as I had feared. Difficult. Unfair. But not precarious. I also called Robert. He answered. I had not known if he would. He answered, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said my name in a voice that had the shape of an apology already built into it. I told him that I knew everything. I told him that my lawyer would be in touch. I told him that I expected full cooperation on the financial matters, or I would pursue every option available to me under Ontario family law, and that I had good counsel, and I was not afraid to use it. He said yes. He said he was sorry. He said he had not wanted it to end this way. I said, I am sure you didn't. I did not say it cruelly. I said it the way you say something that is simply true of fact, observed, without heat. He was quiet for a moment. Then I told him that I had one question and I wanted an honest answer. I asked him whether the woman knew about me, whether she knew he was still legally married, still living in our house in Mississauga, still calling me every few days while he was supposedly resetting his mind in Calgary. He was quiet for longer than I was comfortable with. Then he said that she had known from the beginning that he was married. I said thank you, and I ended the call. There is something clarifying about that knowledge that she had known. It does not change anything in a legal or practical sense, but it clarifies the picture. There was no innocent party who had been deceived on that side of things. There was a set of choices, made by adults who knew what they were doing, and I was the person those choices were made against. That clarification mattered to me. I'm not entirely sure why, but it did. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. It was not contentious, which is to say that Robert did not fight my lawyer on the substantive issues, which I believe was partly conscience and partly the understanding that fighting would not serve him. I kept the house. I received a fair division of our joint assets. My lawyer was worth every dollar I paid her. I sold the house in Mississauga 8 months after the divorce. I want to be honest about why. It was not only grief, though grief was part of it. It was also practical. The house was large for one person, and it was expensive to maintain, and I did not want to spend the next decade paying to heat rooms I never used. I found a condominium in Burlington, near the lake, on the 4th floor, with a balcony that faces west. I moved in on a Saturday with Christine's help and the help of 2 very efficient young men from a moving company. I put the boxes in the rooms they belonged to, and I sat on the floor of my new living room at 10 o'clock that night with a glass of wine, and I looked out at the lights on the water. I am not going to tell you it felt like triumph. It did not. It felt like the strange, clean emptiness of a life that has been stripped back to what is actually yours. Daniel and I have been rebuilding. It is slow. I called him 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and we talked for 2 hours. He wept a good deal, and I let him. I told him that I was not going to spend the rest of my life angry at him, because anger is expensive, and I had already spent enough on things that did not serve me. I told him that what he had done was wrong, and that I needed him to understand that fully, not to diminish it, not to explain it away. He said he understood. I believe he is trying. It will take time. We speak every week now. It is not the same. I do not know yet what it will become. I joined a hiking group in the spring. A friend from the hospital had been in it for years, and she invited me, and I went, half-heartedly at first, and then with more conviction, because it turned out that walking through the Niagara Escarpment on a Tuesday morning with 8 other women of various ages was exactly the kind of thing I had not known I needed. I have seen parts of this province I never bothered to look at when I was too busy being a wife and a nurse and a mother to be just a person walking through the world. I have been to the East Coast, not with Robert as we planned. I drove there myself in September, just me and a road atlas and a bag in the back seat. I did the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia on a Thursday. I pulled over at a lookout on the Highlands, and I stood on the side of the road and I looked at the Atlantic Ocean, and I thought about nothing in particular for a very long time. The wind was cold and sharp, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened to me, and I found that enormously comforting. I am 63 years old. I worked for 31 years as a registered nurse. I was married for 28 years to a man who had a second life I knew nothing about. I have a daughter who drove to my house the night everything broke open and stayed until I told her she could leave. I have a son who made the wrong choice for what he believed was the right reason, and we are working through it, slowly, honestly, the way things that matter usually require. I am living in a condominium in Burlington with a balcony that faces west. I watched the sun go down over the lake last night, and I thought that, for the first time in longer than I could easily identify, everything in my field of vision belonged to me. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough.